Okay, the recording is ongoing. Great. And then I'd like to call upon the first proposition speaker, Gabby Lynn, to open the case for Proposition Team Canada Red. Here.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, awesome. Politics is dominated by the 60-year-old man who won't be around to see our cities drowned by rising sea levels, and who won't be around to see our farmlands turn into deserts from the carbon dioxide that we keep emitting into the air. On the basis that on proposition, we want to hand the reins of the future to the people that will actually be around to see it, we're very proud to propose. I'm going to do a couple of things in this speech. First, I'm going to outline a model, and then I'm going to forward two arguments. First, on why youth principally deserve more influence in elections. Then secondly, how we end up with more representative policies when they have more say. On my model, there are 2 points to this model. First, that national elections are just elections that will affect the whole country. So this can look like primaries, presidencies, or electing representatives for Congress. The second part of this, in terms of votes, is that the votes that you receive are going to be inversely proportional to age. So just to make our stance consistent, there's a difference between an 18 and a 30-year-old in that 18-year-old will probably be around for longer than the 13-year-old, than the 30-year-old, and they're probably going to be less politically engaged. So we would, for example, give that 18-year-old 2 votes, the 30-year-old 1.5 votes, and like once you hit the age of 35, for instance, you have the same weight as everybody else who's older, which is 1 vote. On to my first point then, if there are no questions, why youth principally deserve more influence in elections. So the first premise I'd like to outline here is that equality in elections does not currently exist. So opposition can't run on a principle of everybody has an equal say in elections currently, because that's not true. And there are 2 reasons why this is the case. First, that there are built-in inequalities to elections. So this looks like the American Electoral College, where if you live in Iowa, your vote is worth more than if you live in California, or if you're in Canada, if you live in Nunavut, your vote is worth more than somebody who lives in an Ontario suburb. But furthermore, in first past the post systems, your vote is absolutely worthless if you vote for the losing candidate because that person doesn't end up in parliament. But furthermore, even in systems of proportional representation, for instance in New Zealand, there are a set percentage of seats that are allocated to Indigenous candidates, even if they didn't receive that amount of the votes. And this goes to show that elections are not equal currently, and we should probably skew this inequality to people that deserve it more. Secondly, though, that the existence of your vote in the status quo depends on how much you are affected by the policies of the state. So for instance, as a Canadian, I am still affected by American policies. When Trump dissolves NAFTA, that's still going to influence the trade that my country can go through. But I don't get to vote in the American election because I'm not beholden as much as an American citizen to American policies. And this goes to show that if we can prove that youth are more affected than other people in a country, in the same way that an American citizen gets a vote and I don't, youth deserve more of a say than people who are older. So then why do youth deserve a greater say than the elderly, for instance? There are 2 reasons for this. First, that youth are subject to the whims of the state for longer. So this is intuitive. If I'm 18, I'm going to live for longer on average than somebody who is currently 60. And every single decision that I might vote for now is going to affect my future. For instance, if I vote in Trump and he's hostile to China, that's going to make it so that my country has a lot more difficulty conducting international relations in perpetuity. Or if I vote in somebody who appoints a certain Supreme Court justice that then goes on to serve for decades, that's going to impact me. Or if you would enact a law that's quite difficult to appeal, that's going to also exist for decades, which means that youth are going to live with the consequences of their votes for longer than everybody else. So on net, they are subject to the effects of those policies and those whims of the state than everybody else. So by the law of reciprocity, we would say that since the youth sacrifice more to the state because they live in that system for longer, then they deserve more say in determining the policies that will affect them for that long time. The second reason that youth deserve a greater say is that they are more affected by the state now. And this is for a few reasons. First, that young people on average tend to be poorer because when you've been alive and you've been working for a shorter amount of time, you've had less time to save money. So this means that youth, for instance, are more likely to be dependent on welfare, or furthermore, they're more likely to be dependent on unemployment benefits, because when you're fresh out of college, it's quite difficult to get a stable job. That stability comes later on in your life. But furthermore, there are also structural things, such as the need to attend public university. The state keeps jacking up university prices. So that means that you need to get like $300,000 in federal student loans from the state. So of course, there are going to be poor people and other demographics and people that are dependent on the state, but youth structurally are dependent on the state, and that's why they deserve that say. So the thing to note here is that policies that are equal on paper are not necessarily fair. And there are already precedents for the state to help people that are underrepresented, such as policies like affirmative action. So we would just extrapolate those fair policies to a broader national electoral system and say that people that are more deserving of a greater say receive that say that they deserve. Before I move on into my second point, I'll take a POI if there is one. Okay. If there are no points, then I'm going to move on into my second point about how we get more representative policies. The thing to note off the top is that empirically, people who are older are more likely to vote. This is shown in the voting statistics of almost every single democratic country. So giving more votes to youth is going to make them vote more. And the reason for this is that voting is a cost-benefit analysis. So you weigh out the benefits of voting and potentially getting the candidate that you want versus the cost of voting in terms of things like time and the engagement that you have to put in. And the costs outweigh the benefits of voting for youth for a couple of reasons. First, that they might have to take time off work if their work is unstable and they don't perceive that they have that great of a say in an election. They might be less likely to do it. Or for example, taking time to research while it might not always be the most exciting thing, or youth having less capacity to do things like donate to political campaigns because they might not know which campaign they want to donate to, or they might not have the money to do it. So this means that in the type of political engagement in the status quo, youth don't feel like they have a voice. But under our side, you change that perception, because when you give them double the vote of anybody else, it shows them that they matter more than other voters. They're likely to feel like they have a responsibility to vote because that added influence has been endowed to them. Of course, besides this, the youth that already vote have their votes doubled, so you get massively more power to youth either way. And the impact of this is that you're going to get a larger voting bloc for youth, first of all, but furthermore, also younger and more representative politicians towards youth. So when it's primarily middle-aged people and elderly people voting, you get older politicians who are voted in because you never want to vote for somebody that's younger than you. There's a type of wisdom that's attached to age. But now the average politician is probably going to be several decades younger now because the youth are going to be voting them in. So you get rid of these sorts of establishment types who primarily pander to the elderly and the wealthy. You have them be more representative to the average citizen. But the greater impact of this point is that you get more policies that focus on the future. And I'm going to forward a couple of illustrations here. If I'm 75 years old, I'll be dead in a few years, so I might as well pull out of the Paris Agreement to insert my country's international power instead of voting for things like climate change reform. If I'm 75 years old, I might as well build 100 more F-22s so my country can win the war it's in right now, because who cares about my massive deficit when I'm not the one who'll have to pay it through taxes 20 years down the line? And if I'm 75 years old, I don't care about the fact that the minimum wage hasn't caught up with inflation for the last 30 years, because my life was fine in 1980 and I'm not the one who has to deal with barely surviving on my minimum wage paycheck. But as a 20-year-old, even if I'm not perfectly socially aware, I'm still going to think about the future of my country and the future of my planet, because I'll be around for 70 more years. And I'm going to care about the land that my unborn children and my unborn grandchildren still have to live on, because my future has not passed yet. It's still to come. And this is important for two reasons. First off, these type of policies concern the most crucial existential issues, whether people can access livable wages when they're young, or whether our planet is going to go down in smoke 50 years down the line. But we should also care about future lives, people who do not consent to being born, who still have their whole lives ahead of them. This is the principled weighing that we gave in our first point. There are an infinite number of future generations that are infinitely more valuable than we are right now. On the basis, the future lies in the votes of youth, we're very proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech.
Panel, let's take a look back at our history textbooks. The suffragette movement, wherein women threw themselves in front of the crowds, in front of the police, willing to sacrifice their lives simply because they did not want their voting rights to be compromised. This is to say that though the proposition's word might not necessarily look exactly like that, we still think that it gives you these incidents that have already taken place in the past tells us that the population isn't willing to let voting rights be unequal in the first place, right? The proposition had to tell us why it was not wrong to make the rest of the population feel less important, and why age is literally the metric as to how they can decide who receives the greater weightage in terms of voting rights. What do they tell us? We just want to clarify beforehand that the youth does not necessarily does not really include people who are above the age of 30 years, and which is mentioned in their model. We really think that they have really expanded the reach of their model to all people, to like from 18 to 30 years of age. We don't think youth really includes any people above 25 years of age, simply because it lies in the definition itself, right? But also, but let's look at but let's look at what they've told us in their speech, right? They tell us that they tell us that there is already inequality in elections. It doesn't really matter if we just further it a little bit more, right? It doesn't really justify it doesn't really justify on their side of the house why they're right why they're right in making voting rights even more unequal than it already is in the status quo. But also, the only justification that they give us so far is that the young people are those who are subject to more whims of the state for a longer period of time. They face consequences for a longer period of time, right? But also, in the longer term, if this was to happen at all, we think that senior citizens are less likely to be given importance. The government would be campaigning off of the youth welfare, and therefore the senior citizens, they would be the ones who would be facing consequences on their side of the house. They would be the ones who are given less importance. They would be the ones who are facing greater whims on their side of the house, not and the whims would not be proportionately spread across the population. Those who are less important in the eyes of the state, those are the ones who would suffer most on their side of the house. But also, they never tell us why it is that older citizens vote more. No analysis at all, only telling us that some stats prove it. No analysis as to why older citizens are likely to vote more. But even if they were, they have an underlying assumption on their side of the house that simply by giving more importance to the vote or more weightage to the vote somehow makes the youth feel more empowered. Well, it's not really like that, right? If the government and the state are more capable of bringing about change, if they bring about real change, if they can fulfill the promises that they do, if they can promise to the youth that they do bring about change, if they are elected, we think that that's what really matters more to the youth, or really anybody who has the right to vote. And also, even if the governments cannot really promise to the people or even bring about the changes that they promise, we think that if the people feel that there is something if the people feel that it is necessary for them to contribute, if it is necessary for them to contribute, if there's a pressing problem that directly affects them, we think that those are the things that really motivate people to vote in the first place, right? And if at all but if at all they do empower the youth, we only think that that's a short-term benefit, because there is no structural reasoning as to why the youth would keep coming back to governments that do not even fulfill their promises. Simply because you give them more importance to their votes doesn't necessarily mean that they will keep coming back to vote again. We don't really see much of a change on their side of the house in the long term. But also, we think that in the status quo, all voices are already accounted for. Youth already do feel important. We don't really see why there's a need to implement that policy in the first place. But also, they make another assumption that senior citizens vote for senior citizens, or people who are not youth tend to vote for people who are older, right? We don't really see how that works either, because we vote people because in everybody's knowledge, we're pretty sure that we vote people based on their efficiency, whether whether they really care about the welfare of the state, welfare of the people. We don't really see how age really matters in today's modernized and civilized society, where that really isn't a metric to decide if a politician will bring you any benefit at all, right? But also, they push forward this narrative that simply because you're older than the youth age, your voice doesn't matter. You don't necessarily you aren't any more important to the state anymore, right? But also, they tell us that young politicians are more likely to bring about change because the policies that they bring about will be affecting their generation more, right? And senior citizens who will be dying, like, let's say, next 10 years, they don't really care about the policies that they enact, simply because it doesn't affect their generation, right? But we already think that politicians have a mandate when they campaign for the promises that they're campaigning for during the electoral campaigns. We don't really see how there is any less of an incentive for older politicians to carry out what they promise for on our side of the house either. But let's move on to in our stance. Let's move on to our stance, right? We are against privatizing the votes of any specific group because we believe in equal representation and participation. And we think that if at all, if there is any reason, any method as to how we can empower the youth, if at all there is any problem like that, we think that we can do that through educational programs, and also the very educational the effect that campaigning has, and also empowering the population through several other ways, education in the educational form, not necessarily providing them an unfair advantage over the rest of the population. Let's look at the principal reason as to why they are unjustified in going against the very ideals of democracy. There is an equality before law, right? In democracy, all people deserve equal representation. But this is inherently right because it's fair to the population that literally elects their leaders, right? And when it's in a national election, the stakes are a lot higher because the entire population needs to be fully engaged and properly engaged, and not and needs to be accommodated on our during national elections, right? And rights are not supposed to be given in accordance to the benefits that only solely based off of the benefits that come upon it, and only simply and that too in abundance, but only with but only and that too unnecessarily, which is what they do on their side of the house, right? But we think that it can have detrimental consequences because senior citizens become less important. They get pushed out of the voting process because they feel like their voice is less heard, they're less important, and even if they do vote, they wouldn't really bring about much of a change because there's an overpowering youth that'll bring that only bring about that only elect those leaders that bring benefit to them, right? But all that, therefore that's contrary to their side when they tell that when they tell that they're actually solving the inequality that already exists in elections, right? But also we think that politicians begin campaigning based off of youth welfare only, and therefore on their side of the house, things like senior health, senior citizens health, senior old age homes, etc., become less important. The demands, because inherently the demands of the youth and the demands of senior citizens are already different because age determines the needs and the necessities of the people as well. And therefore I'm so proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech.
I want to do three things in this speech. First of all, ask two questions in terms of clash. Number one, is this just? Number two, does it empower youth? And then we'll bring our third and final argument on proposition on populism. First of all, is this just? We outlined clearly in our principle a number of observations. Observation number one, which is our central principle, is that the state, and intrinsically of being a state in definition, will always be coercive. You cannot control where you live. You do not consent to the social contract. You do not consent to the rules and regulations that bind you as a person. Inherently, everyone is beholden to the state. So crucially, our principle is this. The only way you rectify that inherent coercion from the state is for the state to give some sort of representation in form of the vote, to give some semblance of control for individuals to shape the processes of their life. But what Gabby clearly outlined in her first speech is that control and power for youth is to a lesser degree and lesser accessible than to other demographics. So crucially, it's not just that the youth are coerced more and that they're likely to live longer in the future and be subject to all of these rules and regulations for a longer extent. It's also the fact that the vote, the primary form of that coercion rectification, is less accessible for them. The fact that politicians will largely cater towards older demographics because statistically and empirically, they're more likely to vote. Their counter response is that just because it's unequal right now doesn't give a justification to make it more equal, but obviously that's a massive straw man of our argument. Our argument is that right now, coercion is massively unequal, and the way in which you rectify that coercion is unfair for youth, so our mechanism is to make it less equal. Obviously, they needed a more robust response. Their better response is that this is going to pragmatically lead to a decline into elderly representation, to which we have two responses. Number one, there's already popular will to support elderly policy right now, and this is because elderly people often vote more, and as such, there are more politicians, usually older ones by age, who represent them. And the reason why they vote more is because they have more time. The fact that they're retired means they can spend more time on researching candidates, for instance. The fact that they are wealthier by the virtue of the fact that they amass more wealth, and the fact they've been working in capitalism for 50 years means that they have more savings and life amassed capital, which means that they can donate and lobby certain politicians that they really like. This is why there's a good amount of popular will for things like pension, for instance, is because elderly people are in fact a powerful voting bloc. But the second thing we should note is that youth people will probably care about elderly people to a pretty good extent on our side of the house. And the reason why is twofold. Reason number one is that youth and young people will be elderly and old at some point. And by virtue of this motion, they're probably going to care about the long-term implications of their vote. But the secondary reason why this is the case is because young people do in fact have parents and grandparents that they are fundamentally empathetic towards. It's their grandparents that they do care about, that raised them since they were a young child. So that virtue of human empathy exists on our side of the house. Later on, I'll explain why that empathy actually exists asymmetrically and doesn't actually apply for old people and young people. Their argument and central principle is on democracy, and that democracy should guarantee one vote for one person, to which we have two responses. The first thing to note is that within democracy, empowerment and representation is probably the most salient principle. So for instance, in the US, we already established that there's more political power by virtue of the electoral system for smaller states and suburb areas. This just indicates that empowerment and the skewing of votes is in fact a justified policy. We do concede that people in California probably have more accessibility in terms of politicians and information than a small suburb in Iowa. This is why the Electoral College does things to do things like encourage empowerment and representation. But the next thing to say is that most democracies do have things like affirmative action policies that is fundamentally against their principle. It's affirmative action and quotas for gender minorities and women in Rwanda, for instance. So there are caveats to democracy. It isn't just about purely giving one vote to one person. Democracy is a tool to serve the people, and we say that we serve the people best. Secondary theme, does it engage youth? We say that we create more representation on our side of the house, and their counter response is that it is not needed and that youth are already empowered. But we should note that older people do not affect and vote for younger people for the reason that they feel like they are less competent, and that people vote selfishly, especially older people, because there's this perception that young people do not deserve their empowerment. This is why this empathy argument and empathy mechanism, as established in theme 1, does actually apply asymmetrically, because there's an asymmetric in things like perception, where older people will not actually view young people as competent and actually informed enough. But the second thing to note is that their response just ignores all of the mechanisms that we gave on why youth are not empowered right now. Like obviously there are empowerment movements like Greta Thunberg in terms of climate change, but the fact that they're restricted from the vote given that they have to go to college, they have to go to work, and the fact that they have less information just means that they don't actually vote. So the weighing and the implications of argument 2 by proposition is twofold. The first thing to note is that we just get more long-term policy on our side of the house. Instead of having 4-year election cycles where policy is enacted by older people and then ripped away again by the next party, we get long-term policy because youth are actively able to act as a voting bloc that votes together. That's the legislation that we get. But the second weighing mechanism that we noted is that future generations, unborn children who do not consent to the coercion of the state, are probably protected to a greater degree on our side of the house. It's when youth people vote for things like climate change and green policy to craft a better world for their children. So that's another weighing mechanism. We don't just protect the representation of people right now, we also protect the representation of unborn children who are going to be coerced for 95 years in the future. Before I go on to populism, I'll take a POI from Qatar. All right, given that they're none, populism. The thesis of this argument is that populism and its widespread appeal in older age demographics often acts in a counterproductive way towards democracy, and that this motion is exclusively the only way to rectify that. In setup, I want to explain why 2 reasons why populism is so popular in older generations. Reason number 1 is that older people tend to have more traditional and conservative viewpoints by virtue of the fact that the time period that they grew up in. So in the 1950s in America, for instance, old people probably had things like more of a conservative education or political opinions that were widespread popular in traditionality. And this translates to later stages of their life when it comes to voting when they're 70, because people are often adverse to change. They're often comfortable with what they know and what they learned at a very young age. And on team proposition in Canada, we want to stress the importance of the older vote when it comes to populism. Trump would not have won if he didn't argue on a nativist approach and a nationalist approach and do things like support a Muslim ban if he didn't cater towards older demographics. Brexit wouldn't have passed on either side of the house if the Conservative Party didn't go and cater towards the insecurities and the nationalistic sentiment of elderly people. But the second reason why older people are more likely to vote populist is that there are certain life events that they go through that young people don't go through that pressure them to vote in a certain way. It looks like the fact that older people in Israel, the vast majority of them, voted for conservative politician Benjamin Netanyahu, who, by the way, is the prime minister now, because they went through wars, because they went through conflicts, because they went through a bunch of intifadadas. So the unique empowerment of populism here is that populism is able to appeal to all of these wars and conflicts that these people go through. They're able to exploit the human emotion and the human emotion of overriding fear. Although it's vague political claims that they support, it's fear that they support that is inherently empowering. So the problem we have with this type of populism is not just that it is bad policy and that a Muslim ban is probably bad, it's also that it blocks progressive legislation from being passed, and it blocks it in an unfair manner, and that democracy is about an equal introduction of ideas, but if a peace deal is constantly struck down by older Israelites, that's obviously not democracy. If an immigration reform deal is constantly struck down by older political populists in the US, obviously that's not democracy. All of this goes to show that all of the political deadlock that is attributed to populism has some form of tie to democracy. And the way in which we rectify that is through giving youth people more of a vote. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech. An opposition speaker to further the opposition case. Here.
Am I audible? All right. 3, 2, 1. If a democracy had built a principle based on free and fair elections and equality law for countless reasons for the benefit of the people of the nation, then why do we have a proposition here in the first place? Because again, the proposition is another set of views that don't understand the detrimentality of what they're standing for and thus proud to oppose. In my speech, I will do 3 things. Firstly, I will prove to you the detrimental reality of propositions metric, and I'll talk about secondly, I'll talk about how we're benefiting much more than the propositions metric, and thirdly, how we still stand strong in this debate despite propositions accusations of our true reality, right? So before I move on to that, what are rebuttals? Firstly, they talk about how on the point of how youth are not empowered enough and why propositions how proposition providing a weightage to the value of the youth's vote is going to empower them is a completely vague and baseless point, because firstly, they couldn't guarantee to us that despite us telling them how they're empowered and how they do work in the society, they still claim that the youth are going to be empowered, because at the current status quo, they're not empowered. Ladies and gentlemen, let us review the status quo, right? Take the BLM movement, for example. The BLM movement was majorly run by the youth themselves. That is why they are protesting and rioting for the defunding of the police. So because they are empowered already, they are fighting for what is right for their nation, what is right for their society, what is right for all people in general. And this is what is incentivizing them to vote the right party, which is something that is already existing. So believing that I've guaranteed that youth are already empowered, let us move on to the second part, which is about where they talk about how senior citizens don't care about the youth, and thus we the empowerment and greater uphold for the youth. Firstly, what guarantee can they give that the senior citizens don't exactly care about the youth, right? We don't see an analogy here or any sort of logic explaining that the senior citizens don't care about youth. We see that in a society where both senior citizens, where there are both the older population as well as the youth, we say that they're both equally contributing towards the society, right? Without the older population, we see that there wouldn't be any bigger, more experienced people or more views shared upon. And we see that even on your youth side, or the stakeholder of the youth, we say that even without their opinions, the better solution would not be brought out for the benefit of the whole entire society. So we see that because both of these stakeholders are equally contributing to the betterment of their nation, bringing one stakeholder a higher value is only going to bring more detrimentality to the society as a whole and for the election process, and is going to affect the right vote or the right leader to be elected. And believing that I've justified the rebuttals, I'm moving on to my own case. Firstly, under the point of how I'll be proving to you the impacts of propositions metric, the first point I'd like to talk about is about a fair election, right? So we see that when we're giving more weightage in value for more, when we're giving weightage in value more for the youth than the older population, it isn't exactly where our democracy was based and built upon, right? So moreover, the decision made on which the politician wins isn't exactly correct, because the value has been doubled. So we see that firstly, there isn't a fair election, and secondly, we see that the leader that has won the election the winning leader couldn't exactly guarantee their win because the major of the youths had a double weightage in their vote. So for example, let's take two parties, right? Party A and Party B. So if the Party A had more youth youth voting for them, then despite it being the negative party, or despite it being the wrong leader, we see that they will have an instant win because they were able to influence more youths. Now, and if the Party B was the exact leader that the nation required, which the older population was aware of, despite because of the experience that they've had, because of the experience that they've had, because of how they know that their elections run, we see that we see that they are bringing down their no thank you we are bringing down we are bringing down the right leader to be voted, and we see that we are not running these elections in a fair manner. Furthermore, what we see on our side, right? We are equalizing the value for all citizens, for all people, despite their age. We're not considering age as a major. We are not considering age into a factor for who has a higher vote. Instead, we're giving the vote in equal terms for these elections, right? And when that happens, we see that there's a fair election, just as democracy was built on. Now, when we have a fair election, we see that the right leader is voted, and the right leader is voted from what the people require and what the people want, and not from just one party's influence, right? Now, furthermore, we see that the youth population. Secondly, we see how the importance for senior citizens vote becomes less acknowledged. Under this, we see that the youth population will be prioritized because we see that the youth population will be prioritized on proposition side because they make the votes higher because the weightage for the value of the youth is higher. Now, because the weightage in the vote is higher, this is what is contributing to the win of that specific politician, right? So when this happens, because they have a double value, and because the politician becomes grateful to them for their support, they will only heed to their youth population, right? So ultimately, they become first priority. This doesn't leave any space for the requests and the needs that the old population need or require, and it is immoral to leave out the demands, as well as they are also the members of the society of the very same nation. So they deserve their rights and opinions to be heard and discussed upon as well. Now, what do we see on our side? On our side, we are bringing down these votes with equal weightage, which isn't going to detrimentally impact the value for either of these stakeholders. We see that both stakeholders have equal value, and both stakeholders are working together to in order to decide what is right for their nation, right? We see that both their opinions are being taken into value, and both their opinions are being taken into value, and both their opinions are heard out for the benefit of their society. Now, furthermore, how are we benefiting both stakeholders, right? So by giving equal value for every individual's vote, we are creating a balance of society, as well as how the people perceive every individual's vote. We see that when youths have a higher weightage in vote, there is an imbalance in the society, and having any major because we see that the older populations will be lowered upon on the basis of their age, and they won't have any major contribution or any importance in the role in their society, as proposition claims. And this is wrong, as they, despite not having many years to live, it doesn't mean that they have no further role in voting the candidate for the nation, right? They still have years continue in contributing to their society, and taking the early decision as proposition to heavy the youth's votes and having the vote of the older population less in comparison, just because they're going to die anyways. Yes, they may die soon, but with that decision, it still doesn't justify that their votes should be lowered to that of the youths. And believing that I've justified my side of the case, let the motion fall.
Thank you for that speech.
Can everyone hear me all right?
Yeah, just hold on a sec.
In this debate, what opposition feared the most is that older voters are going to lose power. And they continuously asked us whether or not we actually proved that older people vote a lot right now and that younger people don't vote enough. But they ignored the answer that we gave them in the first 2 minutes of our first proposition speech, that it's much more difficult for young people to go to the polls because they're too busy with building their career, that they don't have enough money to donate to political parties and influence the policies and the candidates they want to support because they have to pay off their student debt and they have to buy their new home. This was unstrategic for opposition because the failure to respond to this basic characterization that we already explained from first undercuts all of their material. It means that you don't have this overpowering youth that is going to eliminate all these policies that are currently good for older generations simply because they don't vote right now, so you simply balance the playing field. Given that, I'm going to discuss 2 questions in this speech. Firstly, which side gets better policies overall? And second of all, is this morally required to do? On the first question, which side gets better policies? So opposition's main case here is that this is going to harm policies that affect older generations. First, opposition claims that this is going to lead to an overpowering youth. But I just want to point out that this was a complete assertion. They just assume that right now, old people don't tend to vote more often in the polls. But clearly they do. Look at the US election, the fact that we have the oldest candidates in the history of US elections. Look at the empirical evidence of young people not actually participating in the polls. But even in addition to all this empirical evidence that we've told you since first, we also gave you the mechanisms for this. The fact that simply young people have too many things on their hands that they can't go to the polls, they can't vote, and they can't support their political parties. So the failure to respond to our principal content or to the failure to respond to this content doesn't just mean that this is still remaining material that stands on proposition that was left untouched, but it also means that none of their content could flow because all of it relied on this one characterization being true. But even if, let's say, there is an overpowering youth and the older generations are going to get less attention to their policies, I would question whether this means the policies affecting older generations are actually going to be harmed significantly. We told you in second proposition that there has been historically a lot of attention paid to the types of policies affected by older generations. For example, pension plans are typically something that are discussed in nearly every single election. But the difference with the policies for younger generations is that they're quite new, because most of these problems that younger generations faced are an accumulation of previous policies that only now can we see the visible effects of it. For example, look at student debt. It wasn't such a big deal a couple of years ago, but it's getting worse and worse, and only now is it showing up in elections. So what this means is that this mitigates a lot of their harms, because even if you do have less talk of pensions in the next election, because there has been so much discussion around pensions in the past, there likely has been many rigorous policies implemented for this. You're unlikely going to get younger generations voting to repeal these types of policies because that's such a tough process. They're probably just going to leave these policies alone, and all of the benefits of those policies that were implemented in the past can still exist on team proposition. What did we tell you then in terms of better policies for young people? We told you that young people are critical because they affect all the future of the generations, as well as the fact that they have to live with these policies for longer. The response that we heard from opposition was quite contradictory. They said, why would the youth keep coming back to vote? But at the same time, they also say youth right now feel important. So this is a contradiction insofar as if you do feel important in the current political system and we hand you more votes, young people are likely going to take advantage of that and keep participating in the political system. Then what second opposition tries to do is mitigate this by saying young people participate in social movements like the BLM movement, for example. But the problem is that youth only participate in social movements and the vast majority of them don't vote. The vote is what's critical to passing new legislation and actually pushing politicians to act. So even if we concede young people are participating quite a bit, they aren't participating enough to actually get the effective environmental legislation in place that is actually going to protect our planet. The next response that Second Op gives is that older generations care about young people. But look, their own material refutes this, because what first opposition said is that younger generations don't care about policies because it doesn't affect their generations. This logic applies symmetrically to older generations as well. They don't care about policies that aren't going to affect them. We gave you multiple illustrations in first that was left undealt with by side opposition. The fact that if you're an older voter, you're 75 years old, and there's a huge deficit problem in the state, Who cares if that's going to impact the economy in the future? You won't be here to suffer through those harms. And so, what this means is that older generations are unlikely to care about young people. And in the absence of young people getting more of a vote, you're not going to get those good policies passed. So, what's the weighing here then? First of all, we mitigate a lot of the damage that they claim is going to affect policies affecting older generations. But even if it's symmetric, let's say we concede that in their best case, the policies affecting older generations are going to be less good on our side of the house. It still matters more that we protect younger generations for two reasons. First of all, they have to live with these policies for longer. It's just a fact that older generations are going to leave this earth faster than the younger people. That means that the tax breaks, that means real estate moguls can monopolize the entire industry and lift all the prices for people to buy houses. These are things that young people have to go through and older generations don't have to care about. But additionally, this affects a much larger group of people, the types of policies that have long-term ramifications. If we don't implement environmental policies now, the earth is going to continue to degrade. This affects not just the 1 or 2 older generations that are alive today, it affects continuous expansion of the population. The 5th, the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, and continuous generations that are going to keep on living on this planet. That's on net a greater amount of people that you should care about in this round. So we win clearly on the fact that we get better policies and more important policies that are going to affect people more importantly. So next question then, is this morally required? We told you in first that this is necessary to offset the unequal power in politics. Once again, opposition just asserts and ignores all our analysis on why this is true. I probably don't have to recap that one more time. But another part of our principle that was left completely undealt with is that you are affected more by an election, and insofar as that is true, you should have more influence. The fact that not only is it because you're going to live for longer with these policies, but also that you're more vulnerable to the state. So the fact that if you're just coming out of college, you're more likely to have to rely on welfare or unemployment, or unemployment benefits, or you might have to go to a public university. All this means is that young people rely on the state much more, and that means they should be able to influence the state in their decisions as well. So why does winning on this principle matter then? I just want to point out, first of all, that opposition had no actual principle standing left in this round. They didn't even have a principle. So the failure to respond to our principle means that this is still something that should be weighed in this debate. Winning on the principle matters because democracy is not just based off of utility. It's not just based off of which side can get the best policy. Because if this were true, we would have to cut out a lot of people from voting in the system because they might be single issue voter, for example, that don't actually vote for the best candidate for the state. There is no objective answer as to who has the best policies for the state. And so the most important part of this round is to determine which side gives most equal and fair representation for the people. In the status quo, it's clearly unbalanced. Younger people are not voting and they are barred from participating in the political system. We give this fairness back to them and we give the future to the youth who are going to have to live in it in the future. I'm so proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech.
Panel, in today's debate, the proposition had to prove 3 things. Firstly, they had to tell you that age is the best metric, but they really don't tell you that. They don't really tell you what incentive do these old politicians have to ignore every single youth individual protesting, why they have to ignore every single youth individual that's actually campaigning, and secondly, they had to tell you why giving me an extra weightage for a vote would incentivize me in the first place to vote when I already had a vote in today's society. They really don't tell you why it is justified for them to tear down the central pillar of elections itself, which is equality. Even if their claim of the youth being ignored was true, it really is more important to strengthen democracy rather than burn it, which they do on their side of the debate. Lastly, even if their most important effects do exist, the problem of a certain section of society being ignored does stand on their side of the debate too. All of this in my speech. The first clash being, is it justified to prioritize the youth over the ideals of democracy itself? On our side of the debate, we tell you that there should be equal representation in the first place. According to the ideals of democracy itself, we believe in a democratic election. It is imperative that the ideals of democracy are upheld in elections in the first place. But rather, they tell you that there are built-in inequalities, so our principle really isn't valid. We believe that even if this is the case, rather we must try and strengthen it, not burn it as a whole. They tell you that equality must not even stand in today's debate. Really, we believe that even if the youth is being ignored, it is essential that everybody has a single vote because of the pragmatic effects that this has in today's bit. And secondly, we see that on our side, we believe that they tell you that youth are subject to the whims in the future. They are going to live longer, and thus they must have better rights. Ladies and gentlemen, no, thank you, sir. Just because my grandfather is going to die early, they tell you that we must stop catering to their needs and only cater to the needs of or only cater to my own needs just because I am going to live longer. It was pretty unethical of proposition to say this, because we believe that no matter what age a person of is, we believe that catering to them too in today's society is imperative. And really, we see that the youth do have a voice in today's debate. They do have a vote in today's debate. That we see that even if they we see that even if they do get a weightage, we see that really they have no incentive to vote in the first place. Okay, so again, ladies and gentlemen, but secondly, we believe that just because they are affected more by the state doesn't mean that we must dissolve equality in itself. We tell you that our principle is more important because it's imperative and it's essential that we uphold the principle of democracies, the principle of election in the first place. They literally have no other response to that, and only state that their principle is there and that there are built-in equalities. The proposition hasn't really responded to our principle in today's debate. So let's just look at as age as a metric. Really, we as opposition believe that age really isn't a good metric to determine political efficiency. We tell you that older politicians still do have an incentive to make decisions that benefit their country and the global society. And just because I am young won't really mean that I would be more efficient to the entire population itself. Following their same logical reasoning, if there are young leaders, that would mean that they would cater only to the young people itself. That is what they tell you. That they tell you that just because old people are the leaders, they'll be catering only to their old agendas and not really to the young agenda. What would happen on their side is literally the same. Youth people would campaign based on their own youth agendas and not really on the on benefits of the whole population itself. That is what happens on their side of the debate. We see that age really isn't a good metric because firstly, it takes down equality itself, and secondly, the benefits don't justify it either. But we as of find it that the youth is comparatively less rational and less experienced than old politicians themselves. Just because I'm old doesn't mean I will be a bad leader to the youth themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, in many states in the US themselves, no, thank you, sir. Many states themselves have hired the age for votes. Why is that so? There have been enough studies to prove that the youth isn't really as rational as people above the age of 40. Ladies and gentlemen, we see that it is imperative that the youth really don't get twice the vote that they deserve, because it tears down equality and it really doesn't get the benefits that the proposition so glorifies in today's debate. We tell you that old politicians will cater to the needs of the youth, which really does happen because of the fact that they still have an incentive to get elected earlier. No, thank you, sir. But on your side, what will happen on your best case scenario is that, as that I have already explained, the old people will be ignored, as my second speaker have stated, as my first speaker have stated, and thus we believe that this motion must fall. So let's address the effects, social effects and pragmatic effects in today's debate. This being the third clash point, are the pragmatic and social effects of this idea beneficial for the entire population? We tell you that on their side of the debate, the youth will be prioritized for everything. And why is that inherently bad? That is bad because they will get because since they have double the vote, this would mean that youth leaders would necessarily be elected. People campaigning for youth ideals would be elected, meaning that they would cater and only implement policies directly affecting the youth themselves, so that they have a higher chance of getting elected next time. What this does is affect sometime later, sir. We believe that this would affect the old people even more detrimental. The entire idea of them literally justifying why youth people would be incentivized in the first place is really what would happen on their side with the old people themselves. The ideas of democracy are being violated. That means not necessarily other ideas would be upheld on their side too. We believe that just because the youth get a higher weightage, I really won't be incentivized, because firstly, they tell you that the youth are busy. So just because I get an extra weightage of my vote doesn't mean I will suddenly abandon my work and go out to vote just because I have an extra vote in my pocket. Before moving on, yes, sir.
Do you support abolishing all affirmative action policies that are currently in Parliament to support the oppressed?
No, sir. We tell you that look, all policies must be there because of the fact that they do cater to every single to the needs of every single population in today's debate. But on your side of the debate, what happens is that policies that necessarily will be implemented will be catering mainly to the young people themselves. This is what is problematic. The problem, you really had to prove firstly why the policies implemented on your side would be beneficial to the entire population themselves, and you really don't do that on your side of the debate. We see that many states of US have increased their voting age. And why is that, ladies and gentlemen? Again, we tell you that the youth isn't really capable to get twice the votes in today's society. We tell you that this will have detrimental effect. My second speaker gives you a comparative on this. My first speaker tells you why it's principally wrong to actually implement this in today's debate. We tell you that voting will make them vote, and we would rather educate these people, young people, on voting, which my first speaker tell you. In reality, rather than being shaped by facts, these youth would be affected more by opinions on social media, since their mind isn't really as mature as that of these adults, and really isn't as capable as them. And necessarily on their side, we don't really see the change that they were standing for in the first place. So on their side of the debate, they don't really prove to you why firstly age is a good metric. Secondly, they don't tell you why their principle is better than ours, and thirdly, they don't really tell you why their social and pragmatic effects do stand in today's debate.
Thank you for that speech.
All the proposition does in this debate is exclude more people rather than empowering those that they claim to be not so empowered and not so politically active. That's what happens on their side of the house. They never really establish many of the analytical links in this debate. They never tell us how old people automatically elect more old people, because we already tell you that we tell you that whoever can cater to your ideals can be elected, and they never tell you how old people always make bad policies, because we already tell you in our very first speech that they have a mandate, they have an obligation to serve for the welfare of the people. Doesn't necessarily mean that every single policy that they make would be bad at all. They never tell us why voting value is the single most important thing that the youth or really anybody would care for as to why they would vote. Because we tell you in our third speech, if at all the youth are busy, if at all they have jobs and other things to care for, then why simply increasing the voting value would suddenly take away the necessity, suddenly take away their commitments that they already have. We don't really see how that the vote suddenly becomes important and their job any less important simply because you increase the voting value. We already tell you in our first speech that the youth really care about whether or not there's a necessity to vote in the first place, which is what we tell you, which is how we tell you that we would be providing these educational programs, etc., through campaigning, which actually gives them an incentive to vote, to tell them that they can create change by voting, not by increasing the vote, not by still letting not by letting them know that simply it's not really the best tactic to simply give them increased voting value, because if they really don't believe that there is any change that they can bring about, if they don't really think that the government can bring about real change, they won't really vote at all, right? Also not engaged at all from their side of the house. They also but they also never tell us why equality and the very fact that the democracy is already broken must be even more damaged, must be wounded even more on their side of the house, right? But also let's look at whether the youth are actually politically active or not. The push that they give us is that old people have more time, and therefore young people are more busier because they have other commitments, right? But we already tell you that youth are the youth are already more politically active. We tell you that they're socially active through these BLM movements, etc. They bring about change in different ways, not necessarily only through votes. We also tell you that even if young people did have a job, if they were actually a lot busier, we still tell you that that simply giving them a voting simply giving them greater vote value doesn't necessarily take away any of their commitments. They still would be committed to all the things that they are committed to, but also they give us another push that the people are already more conservative, that old people are very conservative and that they're traditional, and therefore they're less likely to bring about those policies that benefit most people. But again, this also means that young people have their own agendas to follow, which we tell you in our third speech. And also in our first speech, we tell you that whether or not they're conservative or not, it's still the principle of democracy to accommodate all views in the first place. But also, who brings about the best outcomes through the policies? They tell us that we tell you that politicians will campaign off of only youth welfare, pushing aside senior citizen welfare, senior citizen health, old age homes, etc. But the only response they tell us is that youth care about senior citizens or somehow simply because they have grandparents and and parents and older people in their family. But that again that's not mutually exclusive, because also because senior citizens will also have youth people in their family. They never really establish how it is only exclusive to their side of the house, right? But also it means that they make a really bad assumption that youth are inherently insensitive in the first place. Having won the major clashes, I beg the jury to side with the opposition.
Thank you for that speech.
Throughout this debate, opposition contradicted themselves multiple times in their characterization of youth. First, they try to mitigate our points by saying that youth are already engaged. But if that's the case, then they just accessed all of our impacts. Because if they say that youth are already involved in a lot of social issues like Black Lives Matter, we would say that when you multiply their votes by 2, you get those systems reformed faster, and you get things like climate change reformed faster. But then they say that youth actually won't become engaged at all to try to mitigate our arguments in another way. But if that's the case, then they have no positive material because old people will be fine if youth don't come out to the polls. So in either characterization of the op world, we still access our impacts and we still win this debate. 2 themes I'd like to talk about then. First, do youth principally deserve more say? Secondly, what are the practical outcomes of this motion? On the principle, opposition gives this underanalyzed principle about why people deserve an equal say, but they lost when they took our POI about affirmative action and they said that they supported affirmative action. If that's the case, then that means that equal policies on paper are not always the most fair. You sometimes need to give more representation to currently underrepresented groups, and that is the most fair outcome. We said that this is the most equal outcome for a couple of ways. First, that there are differences in accessibility of voting. So it's more difficult for young people to go to the polls for things like work, school, and the amount of money that they have to donate to campaigns. So regardless of whether or not these young people actually come out to vote, giving them 2 votes is an equalizer in terms of their access to democracy because of their decreased opportunity in the first place. But moreover, we say that they're more likely to come out to vote because they internalize that responsibility and the increased power that they have. But furthermore, we also said that there are built-in inequalities to the electoral system, like the electoral college, voting regions, first past the post, and quotas in proportional representation, which means that since any principle of fairness is already non-existent, that inequality will exist either way. We might as well skew that inequality towards evening out the playing field for people that deserve that vote more, in this case, youth. What are the reasons that we gave as to why youth deserve more say? Note that opposition strawman this. We're not giving elderly people no say at all. It's about giving more influence to people that are more subject to the state's whims. This is why age is a good metric. We said that first, youth are around for longer, so the state owes more to you because you are subject to more of its coercion over the next 70 years of your life. But that secondly, that youth are structurally more vulnerable to the whims of the state. When you attend public university, you need to get loans. When you spend less time working compared to an older person, you're poorer on average and you're more likely to need welfare. When you're fresh out of college and you don't have stable employment, you're more likely to need unemployment benefits. And these are the reasons why, since the state owes more to youth because youth are more vulnerable. And regardless of any practical outcomes, this principle wins us the debate, because democracy is based on the idea that people deserve a say, and when there are no objective answers, we might as well get fair representation. Secondly, on the practical outcomes, Op says that we're going to care less about the elderly, but first we said that the elderly already get attention and youth don't. So student debt is a new problem. While we've been talking about pensions for the last 100 years, we should probably prioritize these new issues. But furthermore, that the young care about the elderly because someday they will become old, but the elderly don't care about the young because they'll never be young again. That inequality was something that they never dealt with. But what we told you here is that youth become more politically engaged. And first they respond that youth are already empowered. This was not a response. They wasted their time. The existing votes of youth still get multiplied by 2, so you access us all of our benefits. But then they said that youth are irrational. So are old people. Nobody is a perfect voter. It's about the types of interests that these voters will have. So what are these interests? We say that we get policies that care more about the future. For the infinite number of future generations who never chose to be born, but who will live with the consequences of our choices. And they never took down this impact. On our side, we can stop the rampant military spending that will place the state in billions of dollars of debt in perpetuity. We can prevent cities from going underwater because of the climate change reforms that we keep ignoring because youth don't get that much of a say in politics. On the basis, the future lies in the hands of the youth. We're very proud to propose.
Okay, thank you for that speech, and thank you to all debaters for what was a fine Octo final.